Greetings everybody, and welcome to this video. So today, I am going to be doing something a bit different. I am going to be responding to a video made by Apostate Aladdin, in which he critiqued verse 65 of chapter 3, wherein he claims that this verse disproves Islam and the Quran and shows that they are false. So, I thought I'd offer my 2 cents on the verse. Anyway, let's get started with the video. In the video, Aladdin claims that the verse is saying that the Jews and Christians have no claim to the previous prophets because the scriptures were established after their deaths, much like the Quran. This, he says, was due to some Jews claiming that Abraham was a Jew, and some Christians claiming that Abraham was a Christian, hence the revelation of verses 65 to 68 of chapter 3. So, let us look at this claim and try and see if he is actually correct. Now, I will not be questioning his reasoning for the revelation of the verses, as it is very plausible that in fact was the reasoning for their revelation. In fact, this does not differ from my own understanding of the reasoning why the verses were revealed. But I will be focusing on the part where he claims that the focal point of these verses is verse 65. From where he gets that idea, I do not know, but I do suppose this is where his error actually stems from. From the video, as well as from its tone, it seems to me that there was not much effort put on the verses following verse 65. All the attention was misplaced on verse 65, and very little reasoning, as well as thinking, was applied to the following verses. But let us put that aside for now, and ask ourselves this simple question first. Why does Aladdin assume that verse 65 is the focal point of the verses he quoted, or of the incident of the revelation if such an incident ever took place? What justification does he have for assuming that assumption? Especially, when it isn't even the first verse in the series of verses addressed to the people of the book in that section of the chapter. But alas, let us move on. So, what does the verse say? The verse reads as follows: O people of the Scripture, why do you argue about Abraham, when neither the Torah nor the Gospel was sent down until after him? Will you then not use reason? Now, looking at this verse, it is Aladdin's assumption that this verse is somehow claiming that, because the Torah and the Gospel were revealed after Abraham, the information contained in those scriptures does not represent the truth about Abraham. He then makes the comparison between this assumption and the fact that the Quran itself was revealed way after these revelations, and yet it claims truths about Abraham. So, based on this line of reasoning, he says this would make the Quran false, or should at least not be used to argue for what the truth really was as it pertains to Abraham. But the problem is that this foolish line of reasoning is actually not what the verse is saying at all. Unfortunately, where Aladdin falters in his understanding of this verse is that he assumes that just because the Quran was revealed after Abraham, it too should not have any justification in claiming truths about Abraham because it too was revealed after these scriptures, or that its adherents should not claim affiliation or closeness to Abraham, since they appeared long after the establishment of the Jews and the Christians. He asks, in the paradigm of gods and logic, why can't scripture revealed after an event describe it accurately? Once again here, you misunderstand the verse, as that is not what the verse is saying. As already mentioned, the verse is not saying that just because those scriptures were revealed after Abraham, they were incorrect in their descriptions of Abraham. Hopefully, he can understand this. He then goes on to say, so I don't see any way how one could make sense out of this verse. It's actually very simple. He also says, how is Muhammad one-upping the Jews and Christians when his claims are the furthest on the timeline from Abraham? Again, this is unfortunately your flaw in your understanding of the verse. You assume as if this is what the verse is saying, whereas it isn't. You assume as if the Quran, as well as Muhammad, didn't know or realize this epiphany or sudden realization of yours. If that was what the verses were saying, then you'd be correct. But I assume you arriving at this line of reasoning was due to your indoctrination prior to you gaining enlightenment, as you might put it. A description which I would not dispute nor criticize. Your misunderstanding is no fault of your own alone. This is a cross that we all have to bear, unfortunately. We have all been prey to this sort of thing, and many Muslims might still uphold the same understanding or views about that verse. So, I would chug that up to you, not yet unshackled from your previous indoctrinations as of yet. Now, I will not touch on your assumptions of the grotesque nature of punishments in the Quran or your accusations that the Quran makes false claims about other people's beliefs, as that is beyond the scope of this reply. Perhaps another time. The verse is not putting forward the claim that because the Torah and the Gospel were revealed after Abraham, they are less credible when it comes to informing us the truth about Abraham. This, unfortunately, is a very poor understanding of the verse, and quite honestly raises a little bit of doubt on whether Aladdin really gave any thought at all when he was researching these verses. It is quite perplexing that this is the understanding that he immediately gravitated to when reading these verses. I guess we can chalk that up to a subconscious negligence on his part, something which unfortunately we all can fall victim to. Now, disregarding or not applying as much rigor on the verses that follow, I understand why someone would assume this to be the case at first glance. But this is the problem when one makes this verse their focal point, and assumes something that it does not say. The Quran is clearly aware that it was revealed after the previous scriptures, and that it came after the other prophets. It is silly to assume that the Quran supposes that because the Torah and the Gospel were revealed after Abraham, that their respective adherents could not use them as justification to claim affiliation to Abraham, or that those scriptures did not offer truths about Abraham. The Quran itself attests to the premise that the Torah, as well as the Gospel, were indeed from God, so it would be impossible for it to make such a preposterous and nonsensical claim. So, what then is the verse actually saying? Well, the answer to this is actually given in verse 67, which reads, Abraham was not a Jew, nor was he a Christian, but he was dedicated and single-minded, one in a state of submission, and he was in no way of the associators. So, how does this verse tie in with verse 65? As we have already covered, verse 65 addresses the people of the book and asks them why they argue about Abraham when neither the Torah nor the Gospel was sent down until after him. Then verse 67 informs us that Abraham was not a Jew nor was he a Christian. So, how do these statements tie in with each other? In this verse, the Quran is linking being a Jew and being a Christian to the Torah and the Gospel, respectively. Meaning that, a Jew cannot be a Jew without there being a Torah, and a Christian cannot be a Christian without there being a Gospel. This is because these two faiths, Judaism and Christianity, are tied to their respective scriptures. Now, obviously, when we say Jew, we mean those who uphold the religion known as Judaism. This same understanding, however, does not apply to the Quran. Islam is not tied to the Quran with respect to what defines Islam, whereas Christianity and Judaism are tied to those scriptures by definition. A Muslim is someone who is in a state of submission to God. Anyone can be in this state, and adherence to the Quran is not a prerequisite. This is why prophets such as Abraham, or Noah or Moses or Jesus can be referred to as individuals who were in submission to God, meaning that they obeyed and did the will of God, hence they were Muslims. The way the term Muslim is used within the Quran, it does not use it in reference to people who uphold the particular organized religion that we know today as Islam. Rather, it merely means someone who is in submission to God. It is used as a mere adjective, similar to the words righteous or truthful. So, when the verse says, "Why do you argue about Abraham when the Torah and the Gospel were not sent down until after him?" This means that reason dictates that since the Torah and Gospel were revealed after Abraham, then he could not have been an adherent of these scriptures. Similarly, the verse is also not saying that Abraham was an adherent of the Quran, as Aladdin seems to indirectly insinuate. Now, if the question were to be turned around and to us Muslims in the following way: "O Muslims, why do you argue about Abraham when the Quran was not revealed until after him?" Then our response to this question would be, because a Muslim is not one who follows the Quran, nor does it mean someone who follows the Prophet Muhammad. Rather, a Muslim is someone who submits and renders their countenance to the divine. We do not call ourselves Muslims because we believe or adhere to the Quran, or because we follow the Messenger Muhammad. Rather, we call ourselves Muslims because we have submitted ourselves to God. So, if a Christian or a Jew likewise submits to God, then they too are Muslims by definition. However, when we ask a Jew, Why do you argue about Abraham when the Torah was not revealed until after him? What we mean by this statement is that, since Judaism is the belief in and the upholding of the law given in the Torah, then we can hereby say that Abraham could not have been a Jew, since the Torah was not revealed until after him, hence why the verse clearly ends with the statement, "Will you then not use reason?" Meaning, will you Jews and Christians not use your intellect and reason to this conclusion? Similarly, if we ask a Christian, "Why do you argue about Abraham when the gospel was not sent down until after him?" The reason for us asking this question is based on the claim by these Christians that Abraham was a Christian or that he was an adherent of the gospel. So, when they make this claim, then we rightfully and reasonably may ask, why do you argue about whether Abraham was a Jew or a Christian when the gospel and the Torah were not revealed until after him? What we mean when we ask this question is based on how the terms Christian and Jew are defined. We ask this question because we know without a shadow of a doubt that Judaism and Christianity are defined by their observance of Torah and the Gospel, respectively, meaning, the claim or argument that Abraham could have been a Christian or a Jew is outside the realm of possibility and reason, and is just blatant nonsense, since these two respective religions cannot be defined without their respective scriptures. Islam, however, by definition does not and never has claimed to be tied or defined by adhering to the Quran, and anyone who says that is completely misinformed or uneducated on the matter. This can clearly be observed in the following verses of this same chapter, which state, assuredly, the system of conduct in the sight of God is submission. Those to whom the divine writ was given did not disagree, except until after the knowledge had come to them, out of zealotry and animosity between them. Whoever acts dishonorably with regards to the signs of God, then God is assuredly swift at taking account. If they then argue with you, O Muhammad, then tell them, I have submitted my face to God, and so have those who have followed me. And also say to those to whom the divine writ was given and to the uneducated, have you submitted? If they have submitted, then they are rightly guided. But if they turn away, then upon you, O Muhammad, is only the duty of conveying, as God is an observer of the servants. Thus, according to these verses, the deen, i.e. the system of conduct or the system of judgment, which God gave to humankind was that of submission, meaning, that of doing the divine will, which God set up in heaven and also set up for human beings here on earth from the very beginning. It is not in reference to a particular organized religion, rather, an approach to living life that we as human beings were intended to uphold and establish upon the earth. This approach, which focuses on establishing the values of those who are in the presence of God, values which foster balance and harmony amongst the creation, is the one which God intended for the human being. This is the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven, as known by the Christians. When Christians say, Thy kingdom come, Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The will that is done in heaven is done through submission, and this is the will that we too wish to uphold on this earth, as that is the only way by which we can bring about balance and harmony amongst the creation of God, by doing the will of God on earth, just as it is in heaven. So, in the verse following verse 19, we see that the Prophet Muhammad is informed to tell those among whom are the Jews and the Christians, if they were to argue with him, that he had submitted his face to the divine, and so had those people who had followed him. Then he was to inquire of them whether they had submitted, and note that these were people who were arguing with him. For if they had submitted to God, then they were of those who had been guided, and they did not need to argue with him about the system of conduct, even when they were Jews and Christians. But if they refuse, and instead say that they did not submit to God or that they did not want to submit to God, then he was merely sent to convey this message to them, and not to try and convert them from Judaism or from Christianity to join some form of a new religion. So, the insinuation by Aladdin that, oh, do the believers not understand how stupid this argument is? Yes, Aladdin, we do understand that your assumption that this is what this verse means is stupid. Now, I apologize for the harshness in my tone, if it comes off as such, however, there was really no level of sympathy or empathy or understanding towards the believers in your video, so I saw no justification but to respond in kind and somewhat the same tone, though I do not mean to be harsh of tongue nor hard of heart towards you. So, when the Quran says Abraham was not a Jew, it is not intending that Abraham did not believe in the one God, since Jews also believe in the one God, rather, that he couldn't have been a Jew, since Judaism is tied to the belief in the Torah, and the Torah was not revealed until after Abraham. The same line of reasoning applies to Abraham being a Christian. He couldn't have been a Christian because Christianity is based on the teachings of the Gospel, and the Gospel was not revealed until after Abraham. However, with him being a Muslim, Islam is not tied to the Quran, as it merely refers to someone who surrenders themselves to God and submits to His will, and this applies to anyone, whether they adhere to the Quran or not. The Quran is quite clear on this, since it repeatedly quotes Abraham as being a Muslim, yet the Quran was revealed thousands of years after him. If there never was a gospel in the Torah, there would be no Christianity and no Judaism, whereas if there was no Quran, there would still be people in submission to God, irrespective of whether they identify themselves by that religious title or not, hence they are Muslims. The word Muslim predates the revelation of the Quran, so it was not a new word that the Quran invented. People at the time knew exactly what the word meant, and they used it in their daily lives. So, when the Quran used the word Muslim to refer to the state of the previous prophets in relation to God, there was no objection to this fact from any of the people, and this was mainly because the term Muslim was not affiliated to a particular organized religion that we know today as Islam. So, when the Quran said Abraham was a Muslim, no Christian or Jew living within the revelation of the Quran would have objected to that statement, as it would be similar to them objecting to the Quran if it were to say that Abraham was a truthful person, a Siddiq, or trustworthy, Amin, or forbearing, Halim. However, due to several factors after the Prophet had died, the word took on a different definition, much different from the one intended in the Quran. So, when someone takes issue with this sort of claim, it is not with the Quran's meaning of the term, rather it is the surrounding baggage that the term has accumulated over the years since the Prophet died. There is a reason why there is little to no evidence to suggest that this term was used as a designated religious title for the followers of Muhammad. They were Muslims, yes, insofar as they were righteous, and so forth, but they did not refer to themselves by this designation. Now, this might be a hard pill to swallow by a lot of people, especially by those who have a problem with the Quran or Islam, but unfortunately, that is a fact of language. If the definition of a Christian was merely someone who believes in Jesus as the Messiah, a prophet and a messenger of God, then we Muslims today are likewise Christians. If that's all what a Christian was, then we would fit that definition perfectly, and I for one would have no qualms embodying that definition and taking on the title of Christian. The same applies to Judaism. If the definition of a Jew was merely someone who believes in God and that Moses was a messenger of God, and that the Torah was a revelation from God, then we Muslims would likewise be Jews, and again, I for one would have no qualms embodying that definition and taking on the title of a Jew. Anyway, that was my response to Aladdin. Hopefully he responds, and if he is interested in having a more in-depth analysis on these verses, then we can arrange a meet. Now, there is so much that I would have wanted to add to this response, but I didn't want to make the video too incomprehensible and a chore to watch. But perhaps, on another day, I will make a more in-depth analysis of those verses, particularly on the word, Hanif, and what it refers to. Anyway, that's all for now. Thank you very much for watching, and take care everyone, and have a lovely weekend.